The movie begins with a woman traveling from China to Hong Kong, carrying a lunchbox. Once she arrives home, she opens each compartment of the lunchbox and discards the food, except for the contents of the last one. Inside is a small dish which she carefully cleans and eats. This dish, called dumplings, is not only her meal but also the title of the film. This woman, named May, is often referred to as Auntie May because of her age. Despite being significantly older, she astonishingly looks like she's in her 30s. The secret behind her youthful appearance is a shocking mystery that will be revealed later in the story. What we do know is that May is famous for making dumplings, which she sells to others. These dumplings are not only delicious but also hold the secret to her beauty and youthful glow. The reason lies in a special ingredient she uses, which gives them their extraordinary properties. The next day, another woman, Mrs. Lee, visits May. Mrs. Lee was once a famous movie star but has since stepped away from the limelight after marrying a wealthy businessman. Her life now revolves around being his wife, a role devoid of love or companionship. She married him solely for financial security and social status, but as time passes, even that status seems to be slipping away. As Mrs. Lee ages, her husband's attention has shifted to younger, more beautiful women, leaving her feeling neglected and insecure. She is deeply troubled by the thought of losing everything she values, especially her youth and beauty. Determined to reclaim her allure, Mrs. Lee comes to May after hearing rumors about the miraculous effects of her dumplings. It is said that these dumplings can make anyone look youthful again by triggering changes in the body that reduce visible signs of aging, enhancing beauty to the point of irresistible attraction. However, Mrs. Lee remains skeptical of these claims and demands proof. May responds by asking how old Mrs. Lee thinks she is. Mrs. Lee guesses May to be around 30 years old. May then smiles and reveals a startling truth. Her actual age far exceeds 30. "You can't guess my real age," May said with a sly smile. "What more proof do you need? The secret lies in my dumplings. They contain a special ingredient, something so magical that nothing else can give you the youth and beauty they provide. Creams, lotions, even surgeries cannot deliver such incredible results. Aging is a natural process, something everyone must face eventually. But the key to slowing it down, to reversing it, isn't external. It has to happen from within, and that's what my dumplings do." Mrs. Lee, swayed by May's confidence, reluctantly agreed to try the dumplings. May presented her dish, and though Mrs. Lee hesitated at first, the thought of regaining her youth pushed her to take the leap. "This might be my last chance," she thought. "What if this really works?" She began eating May's dumplings regularly, even as she grew suspicious of the ingredients. She noticed hints that the dumplings contained the meat of small animals, but she chose to ignore it. Her desperation outweighed her curiosity. Results were all she cared about. May's claims seemed promising, and Mrs. Lee clung to the hope that the dumplings would solve her problems. Meanwhile, her personal life remained bleak. Her husband, Mr. Lee, was frequently away on trips, and she knew he was with younger, more beautiful women. Confronting him yielded little more than dismissive gestures and large checks, his way of compensating for his indifference. Love, attention, and time were things he could never offer her. This lack of emotional connection pushed Mrs. Lee deeper into her despair, making her more determined to regain her youth. Though Mrs. Lee had never been fond of dumplings, her desperation made her embrace them. She even began suggesting ways to improve their flavor, advising May on small tweaks to make them tastier. Days passed, and May began noticing changes in Mrs. Lee. Her skin started to glow, and she looked visibly younger. But Mrs. Lee was impatient. She wanted faster results. "Is there any way to speed this up?" she pleaded with May. "I need to see a dramatic change, and soon." May assured her, "Don't worry. I promise you'll see results overnight." After Mrs. Lee left, another woman arrived at May's house, bringing her teenage daughter, Kate. Through their conversation, it became clear that this woman had once been a respected doctor, handling multiple cases daily. But she had since left her practice. Despite this, she had brought Kate, her 15-year-old daughter, to May for help. The reason? Kate, despite her young age, was pregnant. The most unsettling truth about Kate's condition was that the person responsible for her pregnancy was none other than her own father. Overwhelmed by the horror of the situation, Kate's mother had been frantically seeking help, desperate to find a way either to save Kate and her unborn child or to terminate the pregnancy altogether. When they arrived at May's doorstep, May examined Kate and determined that the baby was already 6 months along. This made the situation much more complicated. May shook her head. "I'm sorry, but I can't help with this case," she said. Instead, she directed Kate's mother to contact a black market hospital. There, they handle delicate cases like this, whether it's delivering the child or terminating the pregnancy. "I still have contacts there," she added, concealing her true intentions. Though May wasn't a doctor at the hospital, she had sinister connections. She would steal the remains of infants from a hospital, using their flesh as the special ingredient in her dumplings. This was her dark secret, the key to her youthful appearance and the magic she promised to others. Meanwhile, Mrs. Lee was unraveling the threads of her own misery. She discovered her husband was having an affair with a hotel staff member who visited his room every night. Unable to bear this betrayal, Mrs. Lee called May to her house, seeking solace. "I have nothing left except this house and my husband," she confided tearfully. "I've always dreamed of having children, of building a family, but for some reason, it's never been possible. Without my youth and beauty, I'm nothing. Please, May, help me." Moved by her desperation, May made a decision. "I will help you," she promised, "no matter what." At the same time, Kate's health was rapidly deteriorating. Her mother was in despair, watching her young daughter struggle under the weight of her pregnancy. May saw an opportunity in their plight. She invited Kate and her mother to her home the next day and, without the use of any anesthesia, delivered Kate's child. The process was excruciating for Kate, but May's intentions were far from altruistic. As the baby was born, a strange smile crept across May's face. She knew she had found exactly what she needed. This baby was no ordinary child. It was unusually healthy and robust, the result of complex genetics involving 5 women. Its unique vitality made it far more potent than the remains May had been using from the hospital. "This child is perfect," May thought. With this, Mrs. Lee's transformation will be nothing short of miraculous. Her youth and beauty will return overnight, just as she dreams. May's dark recipe was about to reach its most sinister heights. The flesh of this child, infused with unmatched strength and nutrition, was the key to creating the most powerful dumplings she had ever made. For Mrs. Lee, it would work like magic, but at a horrifying cost. May thought to herself, if I had used anesthesia to numb Kate during childbirth, the baby's essence would have been weakened. Determined to preserve the baby's unique qualities, she carefully stored the infant's meat in her fridge. The next day, when Mrs. Lee arrived at May's house, May retrieved the stored meat, ready to use it in her special dumplings. Mrs. Lee, who had long been curious about the secret ingredient in May's dumplings, couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. Quietly, she made her way to the kitchen, where she saw May meticulously grinding the baby's meat. Horrified by the sight, Mrs. Lee's first instinct was to flee. As she ran out, waves of nausea overwhelmed her, and she couldn't stop thinking about what she had unknowingly consumed all this time. "I've been eating this," she thought, disgusted. But then, her mind shifted to her predicament. "My beauty and youth are all I have left. As I grow older, everything is slipping away. My husband, my status, my dignity. If I don't do something, I'll lose him forever." The thought of her fading youth terrified her more than the truth about the dumplings. Resolving to prioritize her appearance over her conscience, Mrs. Lee calmed herself and returned to May's house. This time, she willingly accepted the dumplings May prepared using the same horrific ingredient. May, with her usual confidence, reassured her, "These dumplings will make all your dreams come true. They'll give you back your beauty, your youth, and your happiness." As Mrs. Lee ate the dumplings, she didn't just accept them, she relished every bite. The promise of a new, more fulfilling life overshadowed any lingering doubts. May watched her with a knowing smile, certain that the transformation would soon begin. And she was right. Over the following days, Mrs. Lee noticed remarkable changes in herself. Her skin became radiant, her wrinkles faded, and she regained the charm and vitality of her youth. Her husband, Mr. Lee, was captivated by her newfound beauty. He couldn't take his eyes off her, showering her with compliments and affection. For the first time in years, he began spending time with her, putting aside his work and distractions. Mrs. Lee felt as if her life had taken a miraculous turn. Her husband's attention, their shared moments, and her revitalized appearance brought her a sense of happiness she hadn't experienced in years. She believed she had finally reclaimed everything she had lost. But beneath every miracle lies a dark shadow. What Mrs. Lee didn't realize was that such unnatural transformations always come at a cost. And soon, the sinister side effects of her new life would begin to surface, threatening to unravel the happiness she had so desperately fought to regain. Mrs. Lee hosted a grand party at her home, inviting friends and relatives who couldn't help but admire her stunning transformation. Compliments about her youthful beauty filled the room, and Mrs. Lee basked in the attention. But as she took her seat among the guests, a foul, fishy odor began emanating from her. The stench was so overpowering that it drew awkward glances and whispers from the crowd. Embarrassed and humiliated, Mrs. Lee quickly excused herself and locked herself in the bathroom. She scrubbed her body furiously, desperate to rid herself of the odor. But as she stood under the shower, a wave of anger washed over her. "How could May do this to me?" she thought. "She should have warned me about the side effects." Determined to get answers, she called May and recounted the incident. May, feigning ignorance, replied, "I had no idea such a thing could happen. It's never happened to me before. This might be unique to your body. Don't worry, it should pass in a day or two." May's reassurances calmed Mrs. Lee, but she had no idea her husband had overheard the entire conversation. He had long suspected his wife was consuming something unusual, perhaps a rare herb or a secret treatment, and now his suspicions were confirmed. The next day, driven by curiosity and jealousy, he sought out May himself. When Mr. Lee met May, she greeted him with her signature charm and offered him her infamous dumplings. As they talked, Mr. Lee uncovered her dark secret. May was a cannibal who used human meat, particularly from infants, as the key ingredient in her dumplings. It was this horrifying practice that kept her youthful and beautiful despite being 65 years old. Strangely, this revelation didn't bother Mr. Lee. He was captivated by May's beauty and allure. Enchanted, he quickly fell for her, and May, seeing an opportunity, encouraged his advances. She knew how to manipulate him and saw him as a golden ticket to wealth and security. Their relationship blossomed, and together, they began ignoring Mrs. Lee entirely. May now had the rich man she had always wanted, and Mr. Lee was happy as long as he was with someone beautiful. Meanwhile, Mrs. Lee's situation worsened. Her body, now dependent on the dumplings, began to show severe withdrawal symptoms. Red marks and spots appeared on her skin, and she suffered from insomnia. Desperate, she pleaded with May for more dumplings, but May coldly refused. In the midst of this chaos, Kate's tragic story reached its conclusion. The child May had delivered for Kate suffered greatly due to May's negligent and unprofessional methods and eventually died. The trauma was too much for young Kate to bear, and she succumbed to the physical and emotional pain. Grieving and enraged, Kate's mother sought revenge. She murdered her abusive husband, who had caused her daughter's suffering. The neighbors, hearing the commotion, called the police. When the authorities arrived, they arrested Kate's mother. During her interrogation, she exposed May's horrific deeds. The police immediately set out to arrest May, but she was one step ahead. By the time they reached her residence, May had packed her belongings and vanished without a trace. May's dark legacy left devastation in its wake, a shattered family, a grieving widow, and a woman clinging desperately to the fleeting illusion of youth. But May, she disappeared into the shadows, ready to begin her twisted cycle anew in another place. May managed to escape, but Mrs. Lee found herself trapped in an unrelenting web of desperation. She knew she couldn't survive without the magical dumplings that sustained her youth and beauty. Without them, her carefully crafted illusion would crumble, leaving her a shadow of her former self. With May gone, Mrs. Lee realized she had to take matters into her own hands and create the dumplings herself. Driven by obsession, she began to plot. She sought out the hotel staffer with whom her husband, Lee, was having an affair. After some digging, Mrs. Lee discovered that the woman was 5 months pregnant, a child Lee wanted to keep. He had even struck a deal with the girl, offering her a large sum of money to give birth to his child. Seeing an opportunity to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, Mrs. Lee approached the young woman with her own proposition. She offered to pay double the amount Lee had promised, but only if the girl handed over the child to her instead. Mrs. Lee's plan was twofold. First, by taking the child, she could destroy Lee's connection to the mistress, ensuring he would leave her. Second, the child would provide the key ingredient she needed to sustain her youth. The girl, tempted by the money, agreed to Mrs. Lee's deal. Wasting no time, Mrs. Lee arranged for the baby to be delivered through the same brutal method May had used, without anesthesia or proper care. She wanted the baby to be born as healthy as possible, ensuring the maximum benefit for her plan. The process was excruciating, and as Mrs. Lee had anticipated, the girl did not survive. With the baby in her possession, Mrs. Lee coldly carried out her next step. She took the child home, placed it in the kitchen, and prepared it for her twisted recipe. The once terrified Mrs. Lee had now fully embraced the same monstrous path May had walked. She became a killer in the name of beauty. The transformation was complete. Mrs. Lee no longer needed May or anyone else to fulfill her obsession. She had learned the dark art of preserving her youth through these gruesome means. With her wealth, she could now buy children and repeat the horrific process as often as necessary. Her beauty flourished, and her youthful glow captivated Lee, who finally gave her his undivided attention and affection. To the outside world, Mrs. Lee seemed to have it all: a devoted husband, stunning looks, and a perfect life. But the cost of her beauty was unspeakable, rooted in horror and blood. And so, Mrs. Lee's story ends with her achieving her ultimate desire, eternal youth and the love of her husband. But beneath her radiant facade lay the chilling truth of what she had become: a murderer driven by vanity, hiding her dark deeds behind the mask of beauty. With this, the movie ends. If you liked this video, then do not forget to subscribe to the channel after liking the video.